I think the story of yours is actually more interesting than mine.
Mine sort of, yeah, I mean, my father was a production designer, and my brother's just begun as a production designer now, so I've always known. I used to go around all the sets with Dad. He used to work in Los Angeles quite a lot. He did about 30, 40 films. So I sort of went into set decorating as opposed to production design. I was more interested in the sort of the fabrics, the textiles, and that sort of side of it, as opposed to the sort of the drawing aspects of it. And I used to go around with the set decorators on some of my father's jobs. And yeah, I sort of always had a feeling for that, really. So yeah, started as a junior and sort of worked my way up, really. So doing it for about 20 odd years now. So yeah, nepotism at its best.
It's in your DNA, Rob. Just put it that way.
It's in my DNA, yeah. It's a sort of family tradition, really. So, and it's been great. It's been great.
No, I mean, for me, it wasn't something that I knew I was going to do from a child or anything, but I went and studied architecture after I finished school. After 3 years of that, I realised that was drawing too many straight lines, so I went and studied a theatre course, and in Australia there's a very famous theatre school called the National Institute of Dramatic Art, and everyone from Baz Luhrmann, Catherine Martin, Kate Blanchett, all of those people have gone through there, so there's a great sort of film tradition even though it's inside this theatre school. And I was lucky enough to go there, and I graduated from there at just the right time when the film industry in Australia was really booming, and to have had the experience in architecture that I had meant that they were looking for people who could draw. And so when The Matrix, and this is the first Matrix, arrived on Sydney's shores, I joined the Matrix art department. And from that point on, I never worked in theatre again.
For me, The Crown is hugely untypical, because normally I do feature films. Well, until recently I've been doing feature films, when you would come on board sort of maybe 16 weeks before, and then you'd get something like 12 weeks official prep or something, maybe 16 if you're lucky. But with The Crown, I've been on it for 3.5 years, and it's the only time I've ever looked back on my location recce photographs and seen how much younger I was when I started it.
So I'll join after Martin when he's done sort of the initial kind of concept work with the director and looked at the script and locations, and then I kind of come in and then do a sort of second visit, and we talk about palette and colours and how you want to go ahead with it.
Very often, by the time you join, by the time the set decorator generally joins, we have worked out which bits we're shooting on location, which bits we're building, and again, that's usually a simpler thing on a feature film, because the script is there, and you know your knowledge of locations means that you can work out which are the obvious ones to go to, and which are the things you might like to build and which are the things you know you're going to have to build. Whereas on The Crown, it's much more of an evolving thing. So we're going back to sets that we built 3 years ago that are now being turned into other things 20 years further on in their lifetime.
On Black Mirror, I think what I've done over the years is one of the setups for me to be able to be part of the Black Mirror creative process, from the title sequence to the VFX to the design of the shows, was the acceptance that directors are going to come and go, and therefore I needed to engage in really good talent and cast brilliant talent to collaborate with through each film. A big percentage I did without a collaborator, and a big, that's kind of probably a 60-40 split. So I cast very carefully people I liked, people who had brilliant talents in their areas, art directors, supervising art directors who are just unbelievable in specific genre, or just were clearly talents that needed to break out, or designers who were already broken out and were just going to be brilliant to have fun to play with on Black Mirror. And so when I've been kind of teasing with Phil to try and get him on board for a while, and so yeah, this was brilliant for us to collaborate. I think there's so many different routes. I meet so many different designers. I meet art directors who never break out of art directing, and I meet designers who have come from art and architecture and all different routes. And then there's so many different ways in, and it's so busy with the kind of contemporary, with the situation we're in now with television. It's so busy, and there was a kind of big war promotion thing going on. And one of the things with Phil, for instance, is you see people going up the ranks quickly now, and say with our relationship, it wasn't about a promotion, it was actually just he's brilliant, so I wanted him on with me working on the show. But what I would say to people is, for an aspiring designer, the one thing I say is think about the bigger picture. Never be a woman or a man who's trained and ends up putting a chair in the middle of a studio that's green and you don't know what the world around that chair is. So number one, design entirely every building from the floor to the sky. Never do the first floor and let a VFX company look after the rest of it. Always look at it as the big picture, even if you're only doing your small bit in camera. And never tell a designer that you're a designer. So when you graduate as a production designer, for instance, never put production designer on your CV, because and so the key is every designer wants a whole team of designers working with them, but they never want them all to be called designers, ultimately.
Every film is different, but the sort of common thread, I usually, this is my 7th film with Chris Nolan, so we have a established process that other directors I work with, we don't do the same thing. But with him, he's usually in his writing phase, in his house, and traditionally I've always gone in that phase, and we sort of had his old double garage is an art room, and so I try and give him visual ideas or cues for the film. Yeah, again, every film's different. So on Dunkirk, it was really going in to sort of study it because it was such a well-known event. We realized within a week of sitting down at his house that he'd already written the script. It was the shortest script he's ever written. And so we kind of sat there, we looked around, and it's like, we've got to get on a plane, go to Dunkirk. So I actually met him in Dunkirk very early on, and we decided we'd just walk the whole beach. So we walked 18 miles. We kind of realized we couldn't fake any of it. We had to actually go and shoot in Dunkirk, and we had to do as much of it practically as we could, even though Dunkirk's it's a difficult beach to film on, because it's a difficult beach to get off, because it's got a 21-foot tide. It's very particular to the event, and so we immediately knew, even though it was going to be very hard to make the film there, we had to go and make it there. So that's kind of how it started. Then we went back to his house and we spent a couple of months just trying to figure out how to achieve everything, how to do it with as little VFX as possible. How do we do the flying stuff? How do we do the boats? And so we sort of came to the sort of further realization we had to build an armada of big ships and little ships. So then I actually took off and went kind of around most of Europe looking for ships. Looking for the hospital ship, which came out of Norway, the Rogaland. I was looking for destroyers, working destroyers, minesweepers. So we had to build this armada. So it was a very difficult film to try and make practically. So we had to sort of, one, find planes, two, decide how we were going to do all the ships, whether we were going to scale them down, whether we're going to use half-scale ships. Now, half-scale destroyer is 180 foot long, so you can use a boat that's much smaller, and then you have to build the scenery on the decks and make it seaworthy to make a full-size destroyer at over 150 feet. So we sort of came up with all these sort of practical ways of achieving the film. I mean, we're not doing anything new. They've been doing it pre-visual effects for donkey's years. So how do we put an IMAX camera on a World War II plane and fly it in formation and capture that on film? So there was a lot of enormous amount of practicalities. And that kind of, to begin with, overrode the design theme. And then, as we got further into it and we looked at other research, we realized that Dunkirk, everyone sees it as this sort of little, 3-story seaside town, but actually it was a big industrial port. So we really want to play with the industry and the bleakness of the other side of Dunkirk, which kind of played into our film, this lonely place, inescapable place.
Guillermo is very, like I said, very color-centric. The first day we started with an office. I mean, I had the script a whole year prior to that, even though I wasn't working on it. It was percolating in my mind, at least a rough draft. The first day we met, and we basically went through the big color book, and we quickly together we flipped through it all and associated certain colors with certain characters. And one of the main characters is Eliza, Sally Hawkins' character, and her apartment was basically in the aqua hues. You know, she was supposed to be, even when there was no water, it was always meant to feel like she was in this aqua world. The movie opens with a dream, sort of sleeping dream sequence where we go down the hallway and into her apartment, and there's this caustic light flickering through, water. It was digital water and done by a dry for wet technique. But after that, once that she wakes up and settles in, for the rest of the movie, we still wanted to keep that sort of aqua tone and that feel of being slightly underwater. So, you know, in the script, Guillermo had written that the light flickered through the floorboards in the apartment from the theater below. So that ended up being like the flickering light that would come in the dream sequence came from the above, as if it was the sun rippling through the water. And then everything else in there was kind of shaped by water. All the colors were in the aqua blue colors. And our idea for that apartment was that it was Giles's apartment was on one side and hers was on the other, but it was split at one time rudely in the 20s. So there's sort of a Art Deco detailed wall that went between, but on her side was the remnant Victorian wallpaper from the building's history, which was 1890s. And then in that wallpaper, you know, I had Shane sourced out some beautiful wallpaper, hand-printed wallpaper that were in the shape of woodblock scales, you know, so it was like fish scales as a detail that you saw it kind of at eye level. And then everything else was kind of quite brutally aged and worn down from water leaking in the ceiling and everything like that. And then opposite, in Giles's apartment, which is a very warm color, it was in sort of the golds and mustards, and it was lit warmly as well. It meant to be quite different. So you went from her cool blue aqua tones across the hall into his warm, and his warm lit place too. Dan lit his side with sort of this golden hour kind of lighting, and on Eliza's side, it was like always a steel blue kind of color. So it was like a real contrast. But the idea was that, you know, at some point there was a grand room that got cut in half. She ended up in this rundown half, and he ended up in the really crowded half. And he had more means. He must have come from a house. He had a career as an illustrator. She had very little means. There was no art on the walls, nothing like that. And Guillermo had said from the beginning that the walls itself would be like a piece of art. So this is where the heavy aged, patinated walls, that's where that derived from. He'd given me a photograph that he'd found online from an Indian photography exhibit, and it was a real indigo blue wall with heavy aging, with distress on the walls from humidity. And he said, I want one of the walls to be like that. And I thought about it for a long time. And eventually I realized, you know, I can use inspiration for anything to make that, whatever the texture and pattern on the wall was. And I thought of shapes of water, literally shapes of water in art, and I chose Hokusai's famous woodblock printing of the Great Wave of Kanawha. So we superimposed that in a drawing on one of the main walls that we picked as our art wall, and then our scenic artist, Matthew Lamerick, painted it all in plaster. Very, very obvious. Like Guillermo walked in and goes, oh my God, Paul, it's like so literal. I said, don't worry, we're gonna knock it way back. And when we knocked it way back, essentially the mood was, you know, there was this crashing wave that went over top the entry door, so anyone coming into her world was just about to be engulfed by water, you know. So that was just these little subtle details in that apartment that no one's ever going to know without you listening to my story, but it's just, we had to create a little history for ourselves, and it's just some subliminal stuff.
At a point in the process, Charlie wanted to sort of have a nostalgic feel to the
He
front
came in
end.
with a great idea, didn't he? And the thing is, Phil and I were like, oh, and that great idea. Suddenly we were like, hey guys, we'd already started making the set, I think.
Yeah,
got an idea.
maybe, yeah.
I think we were just kicking in, and it was like, I've got an idea, we can make the set cheaper. And we were like, we're going to go to the 70s tone, or the 60s tone. And we were like, oh my God, it's going to look like we can't design sets, and like this is going to look terrible. And so it kind of swayed, the pendulum swayed in design a little bit. And ultimately what we finally worked out was it was going to go there, go here, and then end here. And so that the set itself was going to have to transform from a kind of nostalgic reality of something you'd have on a DVD in an old format on television back in the 60s, 70s, through to playing out as a real world environment, but still in that tone of a slightly old style TV show, moving up to the J.J. Abrams TV show. And we had to make a set that incorporated all of those things. Luckily, we weren't just scrapping what we were doing and starting from scratch with a crap set. We were able to make a great set that we kind of downgraded slightly and took into a kind of slightly nostalgic period feeling in colours and
yeah,
tone.
and then we realised actually it meant we'd have to provide 2 sets, and the final set was the high-end, hard to finish, difficult sort of look potentially if we were still trying to match the great sort of Star Trek movies. That meant the last couple of minutes of the movie were the expensive bit from our point of view, but what we couldn't afford to do was dumb that section of the movie down, because we wouldn't then validate the process we'd been through for the last 55 minutes watching this sort of 60s TV show. So
luckily it stayed
on
on track. So we got everything. We got to, because I think Phil, we discussed it earlier, and Phil was worried, like, if somebody starts watching that Black Mirror episode and they don't really know Black Mirror, and you always have to take a view that you never know where someone's going to start watching the show. So at any term when you watch Black Mirror, someone might just start on a random, out of 19 films I've made, I'm pleased I didn't make a dud. I love them all, but the truth is you never know where someone's going to start, and you want them to stay on board, you know. And I remember the discussion was like, will someone just go, what's this, and turn it over? But actually, no, it was balanced perfectly. You know, Toby Haynes did a brilliant job, didn't he? So
Toby was fantastic, and Steph Pearson, the DP, embraced the whole. You know, we incorporated as much light into the set as we could, partially from just trying to copy the sort of look of the JJ work, but also to give us an opportunity to, you know, turn lights off, change the look completely, wash colours across the set, and Steph embraced that and brought ideas of his own to enhance that and push that on.
Because the thing is that we shoot all of the episodes at once as well. It's not like we shoot it by episode and move on. We shoot it by location. So we might be shooting episode 3 one day and episode 8 the next day, and we just move through. So any of the 600 script pages that we'll have, we could shoot any of those at any time. You know, I remember some days, and particularly when I first arrived, having a lineup of directors outside my office door, and I just thought my head was going to explode.
And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because because of the changeover between directors and directors of photography, like Deb says, sometimes if we're on like a Winterfell set for one day, it might be an episode, you know, 4 scene, and then we'd have to strike it, revamp it for the next day, and then another director comes in, another director of photography comes in. They've got different needs, different lighting requirements, and that happens a lot where we have one set set up for a different team one day and another team we have to set up the next day. So it's constantly shifting and changing in look, you know, just one set, isn't it? So, so that's quite challenging sometimes.
Well, how do we work together? We have discovered, I think, that we have fairly similar tastes.
Yes, that's a very fortunate.
And that neither of us wants to kind of show off. You know, we very much want these sets to look like they've been lived in, and to make them appropriate to what's going on in the narrative. Because suddenly as in episode 4, the one we've been nominated for, it's about a princess deciding she doesn't really wants to break out of the world of being a princess. Now, we've just had 2 seasons of The Crown where everything has been extremely royal. So we suddenly get an opportunity to break out of being not princesses, but breaking out of a kind of royal rut.
Yes, and it's nice to have an opportunity to focus on that distinction, isn't it?
Yes,
and to break the tradition and have a bit more of a kind of layered look, like Tony's studio.
Yes, exactly.
And her move into sort of the bohemian world of the 50s more than the royal world of the 50s.